to hear Suzanne Simard. Today, we're very honored that Suzanne Simard is willing and present to talk with us at our conference today. Suzanne is professor of forest ecology at the University of British Columbia and the author of the new best-selling book, Finding the Mother Tree, which is really a great read and really recommend it. Suzanne is a pioneer on the frontier of plant communication and intelligence and has been hailed as a scientist who conveys complex technical issues in a way that is dazzling and profound. She's known for her work on how trees interact and communicate using below-ground fungal networks, which has led to the recognition that forests have hub trees or mother trees, which are large, highly connected trees that play an important role in the flow of information and resources in the forest. Suzanne has published over 200 peer-reviewed articles and presented at conferences around the world. And we're so pleased to welcome Suzanne Simard today to our conference. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm actually going to talk about my book a little bit and the work that is behind it, and some of the work going forward. So yeah, my title of my talk is Mother Trees in the Social Forest. So let's see. I've been on this big, long journey of understanding forests from being born in the forest. I grew up in the inland rainforests of British Columbia. My grandfather and my great-grandfather and my dad were all horse loggers. And I just grew up in these forests watching this and being part of it. And I went on a spiral of learning, and I know this spiral is significant in many cultures. The Sufi tradition, the Aboriginal cultures, Eastern cultures. And often you can think of starting out in the East at the center and as a person learning and growing and developing. And it really is, a journey of development. And I went on this journey as a kid growing up in the forest, to becoming a forester, to working in the forest industry and starting to understand my world around me more and more, things that were going right and things that were going wrong. And I was kind of like spiraling up like an eagle, and eventually becoming a scientist to make even more sense of this world and trying to make it a better world, especially as to how we treat forests and plants. And really, I feel like this spiraling outward is something that we all do, and I'm sure everybody's doing this in this conference today. And sometimes we also have to connect with ourselves and stabilize ourselves and spiral back in, but that's okay, as long as we keep growing outwards. And I think the spiral also is a really good symbol of Aboriginal wisdom about the integration, the connection, the togetherness of ecosystems and societies. And in the medicine wheel, they have the integration of the heart, the mind, the spirit, the body. And really, this is what we need to strive for in ourselves, but also in how we treat plants and our whole ecosystems, which are our life support systems. I'm just going to, illustrate to you where I've done my work, and I'm showing you first this old map of North America when Aboriginal people were the stewards of the land, where they lived for thousands of years. I mean, there's evidence, for example, on Haida Gwaii, which is up here in Eastern or Western Canada, that people have been on Haida Gwaii for over 14,000 years. So a long, long history of living on the land, living with the forests, looking after the ecosystems, carrying out their obligations to look after the land. And focusing more in on where I'm from, which is in British Columbia, this is a map showing the language groups of First Nations in British Columbia, which there were 30 language groups at least. And there's such a diversity of languages because the land is diverse. I mean, this is a place of mountains and oceans and forests, and they're all interconnected and linked together and influence each other. With colonization, those language groups were really not regarded, and they were split into 203 First Nations, which is really a Canadian government federal imposition of colonialism on the First Nation people. But really they are linked together by language and their common purpose of living on the land and living as one together. I live right here in this area right now. I'm in a little town called Nelson, British Columbia. It is in the unceded territory of the Ktunaxa, the Sinixt, and the Okanagan nations. So my work was all done here, and the work I'm going to show you is from these old growth inland rainforests. These are iconic old growth forests. This is where I grew up, right? These are the forests where my family did selective logging. They would take out white pine and sometimes the occasional cedar and Douglas fir, but it was selective logging. It was just taking a few trees out at a time. Everything was slow and small. The trees were big, and everything was done by hand. So my grandfather, for example, made his own boats. He made his own tools. He made his own flumes. He made his own water wheel to generate electricity. He made the loggers' houseboats that I used to stay on as a child. And so this is what I got to know. I got to know the forest as an integrated regenerative place. These forests are also salmon forests. So in this mountainous place in the world, the forest is intimately connected with the rivers, which are full of spawning salmon. There are so many salmon populations as there are people populations, First Nations populations that are adapted to their local rivers. They go back to their natal streams every year to spawn. And a lot of those salmon end up in the forest, being transmitted to the forest by bears and ravens and eagles, and they actually fertilize the forest. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. And the first peoples were highly dependent or integrated with the salmon too. And so they were careful stewards of the salmon, and they had ingenious fishing technologies that allowed them to count salmon. For example, this is an old fishing weir along a slow moving river, the Shuswap River, and they were able to count the salmon so they could adjust the fishing intensity in each year according to the health of the populations. And they could also choose which fish that they were going to keep and which ones they would let go. And what they strove to do was let go of the big mother fish to go upstream to spawn, so that they would produce genetically bigger fish in the future. And in so doing, by counting and monitoring salmon and by always letting the big mothers go upstream, they were able to keep the populations healthy and strong and abundant. And this generated a great wealth in these ancient societies. And of course, on faster moving rivers, there were different technologies. They adapted according to the speed of the rivers, the local rivers. This is the Fraser River. This is a really fast moving river. And I worked in this area, and I used to see the Lillooet Nation fishing off of these springboards, basically, where they would spear the fish or use dip nets. And it was an incredibly powerful, incredible movement. In a single movement, a man could bring up a fish that would be, a huge fish of 20 pounds and bring it onto the shore. And then, his children, his family would gut the fish, and they'd immediately have them on drying racks. And so it was an incredible technology that was sustainable, because the salmon populations were very thrifty. And here's yet another fishing technology adapted to the coastal regions. This is in the Haltzik area and the mid-coast region of British Columbia, where they built ancient tidal stone traps. And you can see on this aerial photo, the walls they're basically stone walls built along the shoreline that followed the contours of the shoreline at the river mouths. And how these worked is that the tide would come in, and on the ebb tide, when the tide would go out, they would passively collect salmon. But they always let, during spawning season, the big mothers again to go upstream and spawn, and therefore maintaining healthy populations. They also always let go the big mothers to keep the fish large, the populations large. It was kind of like a breeding program, but they were very successful, and these nations were they were wealthy, and they were, well sustained by their technologies. And this was celebrated. It was celebrated in art. This is a longhouse of the Tsimshian Nation, which is near Prince Rupert. There are many tribes and clans in the Tsimshian Nation, but this art is showing, the salmon and the importance of salmon in their lives. And this longhouse, of course, is made of cedar planks, which they harvested from the old forests. And the chief in the middle is showing, the honoring these resources, and also honoring the obligations that they had to look after, to be stewards of these resources that really gave them their lives. They were their life support systems. And interestingly for me, I learned much later in my career that they also knew about the importance of fungi in the forest. There was a Coast Salish man named Subier who actually went on film and wrote about later in his life about the fungal networks that underlaid the forest floor and connected trees together and gave the forest vitality. And it is without this knowledge that I actually embarked on my career as a scientist. As a Westerner, I went to university as a forester who was trying to understand, how forests worked and how forestry practices themselves were what seemed to me disconnecting the forest, basically clear cutting the old trees, replacing them with plantations that were then weeded out and spaced to manage competition, because it was viewed that trees only competed with each other and that the trees that were able to grab the most for themselves are what grew the fastest and the biggest. And I saw this as a wrong practice, that the forest is a connected place, and I didn't like, and I felt really conflicted because I grew up in a logging family that selectively logged, that clear cutting was just such a destructive practice. And so I started looking as a scientist when I worked for the Forest Service at what connected the forest together. And I'm just showing you this word. This is actually a Coast Salish word of the Homokaman language group, Netsamats, which means we are one. And I mean, I didn't know this word when I started out in forestry. Now I understand that all nations, all Aboriginal cultures worldwide have words for understanding the importance of connection, the importance of relationships, of how, forests and oceans and social systems are about connection and relationships. So I learned about these fungi through Western science. And this was a study I'm showing you that was done by a man named David Reed. He was from the United Kingdom. He was a mycologist, man who studied mushrooms, basically, and fungi. And he did this elegant experiment in the lab where he grew pine seedlings together. He colonized them with a single mycorrhizal fungus, and he saw that they became linked together. And I'll just remind you, what is a mycorrhiza? Well, a mycorrhiza literally means fungus root. So myco is fungus, rhiza is root. It's the relationship between the tree and the fungus. And they are in a mutualistic symbiotic relationship where the tree, the plant, provides photosynthate, which it fixes through photosynthesis in its leaves, and provides that energy to the mycelium of the fungus, which grows through the soil and picks up nutrients and water that it then delivers back to the plant. And in a typical forest, an old growth forest, there will be hundreds of species of mycorrhizal fungi. So it's not just one species, as in this artificial little experiment. There are hundreds of species out there, and they each have a niche in how they access these nutrients in different soil pores, different organic compounds at different depths in the soil. And together they're able to exploit or take up the resources to build a big, healthy, productive forest. So I was interested in these networks, and I was interested in knowing whether or not we were disconnecting them. And if this was one of the reasons that I was seeing diseases proliferating in these sort of homogeneous cleansed plantations. We were seeing like mortality levels that we'd never seen before in old forests that were proliferating through young plantations. So I wanted to know about these networks and if they did connect forests together. And this is just a little close-up picture of what a fungal linkage looks like. These are root tips of two different plants. And you can see these mycelium, these little hyphae that actually will grow through the soil and connect individual roots and individual plants together in a network. And I discovered in my research that these networks, they don't just serve to colonize seedlings that are growing up inside the forest, but they're actually like pathways, conduits for the movement, transmission of resources and information from one tree to the next. So there, was a lot of skepticism about David Reed's initial work. There was a lot of backlash against his work because ecologists were really focused on that plant communities were structured by competition. And this really came from evolutionary theory and Darwinianism about survival of the fittest, and competition is what leads to speciation. And that got applied to ecology and really colored the application of ecology in agriculture and forestry in a deep, deep way. But that's what people were focused on, is competition, managing competition. And so I started my work addressing this skepticism about what David Reed found. Do these networks exist, and what do they do? Are they about competition, or are they about collaboration, or do these things happen all at once? And so I went into my local forests, and I started out in forests like these. These are dry belt Douglas fir forests. And I have also extended this work into the wet belt forest where I grew up, the inland rainforest. But I started out here in these dry belt forests because they were simply made of Douglas fir, predominantly Douglas fir, but they were uneven age forests, meaning that there are old trees here. These trees are about 200 years old, and there's trees of all ages and sizes. Some are 50 years old, some are 10, and some are just young saplings and seedlings that are just getting started. So it's like all the generations live together in these forests, and that's how they're structured. That's how they regenerate. So I thought starting in this forest where we know that was interesting. One species makes it simple. And also the mycorrhizal fungi that we knew about in these forests were dominated by one species, which is Rhizopogon. We knew a lot about these already. And we knew a lot about their DNA sequences, as well as the short sequences, which allowed us to distinguish an individual tree, one from another, because they have different sequences, short sequences in their DNA that we can track to distinguish these individuals. We also knew the microsatellites, these short sequences of DNA. For the fungi, we could distinguish one fungal genet or individual from another fungal genet. And we knew that if we could distinguish a fungal genet on this tree, if it was the same as that on this tree, that these individuals were linking these trees together. So we took that technology and those principles and applied it to this forest and said, how connected is this forest together? And so my graduate student and I, Kevin Byler, who worked for 5 years on this, making maps of the architecture of the network, came up with a map. This is one of the maps, and you might have seen this already in the literature. I've used it quite a bit to illustrate these points, but this is a forest that's about 30 meters by 30 meters in size. And these dots, these green circles, represent trees. And the bigger the circle, the bigger the tree. And the darker the circle, the older the tree. And so these smaller dots represent the seedlings and saplings. And so these are seedlings that are less than 10 years old that have grown up underneath the canopy of the old trees. And then these are all intermediate trees of the smaller sizes. So this is that complex forest. The lines in between them represent the fungal genets that link the trees together. So what did we find? Well, we found first of all, that the forest is a highly connected place below ground by these fungi, that every tree is linked to every other tree through, either directly or through intermediary trees. And also that these big old trees, like this one up here in the upper right-hand corner, are the most highly connected. These are the big old trees. They have huge crowns where they have high photosynthetic capacity. They have big root systems with lots of fine roots with many potential points of connection. And they are the most highly connected. And they're connected to all the smaller trees. These small trees here have regenerated within these old networks of many, many species. Keeping in mind, I'm just showing you one of the hundreds of species in this forest, one fungal species, but these seedlings are regenerating within that network. And so when the old trees shed their seeds, they fall to the forest floor around the old trees. The seeds germinate, the hypocotyl grows into the soil. It becomes colonized by that existing magnificent, diverse network below ground. And the seedlings immediately benefit from that huge resource uptake capacity. And so even though they've only got little cotyledons that can't photosynthesize enough to support them, they get supported early on by the network. And these big old trees will transmit photosynthate directly through the network to the small seedlings to help support the seedlings. And so really, I'm starting to see the forest now as an integrated system where the trees are collaborative with each other, not just competitive. And certainly these old trees do compete with the little seedlings. They shade them, they take up water, but they support them at the same time. And my experiments show that the more shaded these little seedlings are, the more the old trees deliver to the little seedlings to support them. And so, of course, the next question that we asked, which was so important, was, well, if they're supporting, these in general, these seedlings, can they distinguish which ones are their own seed? And so we did experiments to investigate this. We knew from the work of Susan Dudley at McMaster University that little herbaceous plants that were clonal could recognize their relatives, and that they were able to transmit information to their relatives about their identity, and that they knew through their experiments that this transmission of information, of relatedness, this recognition, happens somehow through the root systems. And so I thought, I wonder if it happens through mycorrhizal networks, since all trees in these forests, and all over the world, by the way, are mycorrhizal. All the root tips have mycorrhizas on them. And so anything that happens through the roots is filtered through this mycorrhizal network. And so we did these elegant experiments with several graduate students of mine, and we've repeated these experiments several times now, where we grew little related seedlings or kin seedlings compared to stranger seedlings, connected to old trees and not connected to them, and compared them. And we found that, yeah, these old trees do recognize their kin, and that recognition does happen through the network. And they are able to actually favor their kin by sending them more carbon than they do to stranger seedlings, and also adjusting their own competitive behavior. They can shrink their root systems to make elbow room for their own kin. Now, we've only studied this in Douglas fir, but we also know that these trees can also discriminate against kin, right? They're sophisticated in their ability to not just favor them, but to discriminate against them. So they can actually discourage the seedlings from regenerating around them by being more competitive. And this could happen, in areas where there's a buildup of disease, or there's too much there's too many adverse effects around those old trees. And so they're able to actually encourage seedlings further away, and in areas where there are high loads of pathogens and insects. So these are like incredible discoveries, and it's really, changed how I view forests, not just as, a bunch of trees that compete with each other, but as a social network. This is really a social forest. They have a society where they have relationships with each other, and that these relationships are nuanced, they're perceptive, that they change, they adapt according to conditions. These networks prune and grow according to, resources that are available. The trees will respond to each other. They have an understanding, if you will, of their own status compared to their neighbors, whether they're in the light or their neighbors are in the shade, whether they have lots of carbon and whether the neighbors are depleted in carbon. And through this this perception, there is this sort of like a if you will, there's a gradient of sources and sinks throughout the forest that is constantly changing. And this transmission of information and resources is sensitive to that. It changes according to these source sink gradients that are also constantly changing through the forest, because it's a dynamic place, always dynamic. What do mother trees look like? Well, they're just the biggest trees in the forest. And if it's an uneven age forest, it's just the biggest, oldest trees. And they have these big root systems, they have these big crowns, and the crowns feed energy into the mycorrhizal network, which drives the nutrient cycle in the soil through providing energy to the whole soil food web, which cycles nitrogen and carbon and phosphorus and water, and really supports. They really are the nucleus of these highly dynamic systems. And I just want to bring back, to the Aboriginal understanding of these networks and the understanding that old ones are important, not just in their own societies. Elders are important, but also elders are important in forests. And in so many in native languages, which is described so beautifully in Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass, that in those languages, in many of those languages, there's very few nouns, that it's really talking about the role of different members of communities in their community. So elder, the word keteyak, it's a verb. It describes the role of the elder in the community. And elders, grandfathers, grandmothers, elder people, they really hold the knowledge and they endow on the others, the responsibilities of looking after these resources. It's the same thing in forests, right? They're the keepers of the knowledge. They have, the age, they have the genes that have seen many climates in the past. They have information stored in their tree rings, carbon, nitrogen, the history of whether that tree was in hardship or not, whether it was attacked by beetles, whether it was in a fire, that information is stored there. And it's in the genes and it's transmitted to the next generations. And so, these forests are integrated places. Imagine this forest, it's full of old trees and all these trees growing up around of them. This old tree here is surrounded by kin, but also strangers, and they're also in constant communication. So some of my work shows that, these old trees communicate not just with their own relatives, but with even different species, and that they transmit resources all around in different species, and it keeps the whole ecosystem, thrifty and alive and diverse, right? These are diverse systems because that diversity makes them healthy and thrifty. And so it's not just a within species, it's an interspecies phenomenon. I'm just going to move on now to talk a little bit more about the salmon. So in the salmon forests, this knowledge was known, and also the integration of salmon with the forest. This is an old 6,000-year-old village called Hoyat. It's in the Haltsik Nation or the Haltsik territory on the mid-coast region. And they've restored a youth camp here where they bring the youth back to teach them of the old teachings. In this particular area, there are clam beds. There are these ancient stone tidal traps underneath here, and they're trying to restore their traditional ways of knowing. And so we've been studying these rivers and how salmon influence the forest. And other researchers prior to me and our own group have been studying how salmon is actually carried into the forest by these large mammals, bears and wolves and cougars and coyotes and eagles and so on. Not just the coastal forests, but the inland forests too. And these old bears, they take the salmon into the forest. They eat part of it, especially the brains and the guts, because they're high in energy, and they leave most of the flesh to decay. And that decaying protein ends up getting picked up by the mycorrhizal network. And we know from our own research that these networks change according to how much salmon is carried into the forest. So a single bear we know can carry about upwards of 200 fish into the forest a day. The more abundant the salmon carried in, the more abundant the salmon runs are, the different the mycorrhizal networks, the identity and the density of it changes. The soils change, the plant communities change, the insect communities are all influenced by the salmon. And what's left after what we went hunting for salmon in the forest and trees that were influenced by salmon are the bones. And you can find these piles of bones throughout, especially under the old mother trees. And so what happens is that mycorrhizas actually pick up that nitrogen, that flesh, those proteins, and that we can trace where the nitrogen goes because salmon are heavy in this stable isotope called N15, which accumulates in them in the ocean because they're top predators. And this N15 we use as a tracer, and we're able to trace where it goes, the salmon nitrogen goes right into the tree rings of of the trees, and we can count that N15 and we can quantify it, and therefore quantify the populations and the salmon runs, how big they were in each year. And we can take a 1,000-year-old tree and potentially trace back, 1,000 years, what those populations looked like. We can trace back to when colonization happened and those stone traps were dismantled and the fishery was taken over by, in Canada, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. And we know that what's happened to the salmon population since then, they've crashed. And so we were able to see that, and we're interested in understanding then what the effect that has on the productivity of the forest. So forests like this, what's going to happen to them with much less salmon influencing them? And we have a hunch, right? Like these forests are full of feedback loops, and this is salmon fry that have spawned, and they're thrifty here in this stream that is surrounded by big old trees with lots of detritus. The stream temperature is good. This positive feedback keeps the forest is keeping the salmon population healthy, just as the salmon population is keeping the forest healthy. And the Haltzik people and the Haida people and the people on the coast kept these forests and salmon populations healthy too by their careful stewardship practices associated with the old trees and the salmon. And, for example, looking for culturally modified trees. This is a CMT where the people have stripped bark to make baskets and clothing and hats and mats. And they would always, look for trees in certain ecosystems. So this one is by a big leaf maple tree, and they looked for big leaf maple because they knew that the water table was high, that the soils were rich, and therefore the bark was rich and thick and good for weaving. And we know now too that these maple trees and the cedar trees and the yew trees that grow in the understory are all connected together by mycorrhizal networks. And so the intimate relationship is even more intimate than we knew before. And of course, with colonization, we dismantled these people, we dismantled these forests, we dismantled the fisheries. And in the news, you might have seen in British Columbia, we've been these horrible discoveries of these poor children sent to residential school systems where they're stripped of their identities, stripped of their languages. And many of these kids died, and the repercussions of that have reverberated through the First Nations communities. And I would say only now are they starting to heal. But they knew so much about the forest, and we ignored that knowledge. And now we need to reconcile with this and bring back that knowledge, because we all need it. We all need to know these forests in more detail. So we can save these old trees from clear-cut logging, which, by the way, is still going on in a big way. And you might have heard that there's been a lot of protests actually on Vancouver Island, on the west coast of Canada, where the government is continuing to harvest these old growth forests, where we've only got 3% of these iconic old growth forests left. We've basically have clear cut the rest already. And so we're at this tipping point where we need to save them for their genes, for their vitality, their ability to store carbon, to clean water and clean air, to provide hydrology, where we get our electricity from and our fish grow and so on. And so these protests have been huge, and it's not trivial. Like when I say only 3% is left, it's because, I grew up in a province of old growth forests. It's now a province of clear cuts, and it's heartbreaking, and it's affecting the health of our communities. It's affecting, obviously, the health of our forests. And this is on Haida Gwaii. Haida Gwaii is like this beautiful island. It's being clear cut. The people are heartbroken because they're losing their monumental cedars for making their clothing, for building their totems, for building their canoes. And really, this has got to stop. And we're pressuring the governments, because these are leaving our forests more vulnerable, more vulnerable to fire, even on coastal ecosystems where we're seeing fires all up and down the coast. This is because we've basically simplified these landscapes so they're not resilient. And the people are standing up. The Haida people are standing up. The people working with the First Nations, kids are on the front lines protesting. They're getting arrested. We've had 200 arrests in the last month of kids and grandparents and Indigenous people trying to get the government to stop. I think we're making a little bit of progress. So I'm just going to end here to say this has been a journey for me to better understand forests and how the role of forests as plants in our ecosystem, that they are social beings. They're not that different than us, and we need to learn to love them like we love ourselves so that we can protect them as though our lives depend on it, because our lives do. And if we've forgotten, about our relationship with forests, the easiest way to reconnect, to be not so much yourself, is to just go sit with the tree, be with that tree, blend your heart with the heartwood of that tree, and soon enough, within minutes, you will be back there again, being part of the forest as well. So thank you so much, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Suzanne. And if you haven't crossed paths with me already, I'm Rebecca Krinke. I teach in the Department of Landscape Architecture. And for those of us who teach in this area, it's such important work. And it's such important work in multiple disciplines. I can't think of a discipline it probably doesn't touch and impact. And just on behalf on women academics everywhere, thank you for your book. On multiple levels, we thank you for your book. There's an interesting question, like, why all the salmon bones at the mother tree? Do you think the bear and the mother tree, why do you think that is?
I think that these mother trees, they're so big, right? And they have huge crowns. Like some of these Sitka spruces, they have crowns as big as your house, right? They're massive, and they often grow on benches. And so it provides protection. So there's protection for the cubs, and you can see the beds under these old trees where they're big enough for a mother bear and a couple of cubs. And they're also kind of higher up so that they can see around them, they can see predators. So I think that these are, and there's spots where they go back year after year after year, because you can see the piles of bones that are at different stages of decay. And so I don't know a ton about it. I wish I had more time to study these, but these are what we've observed, that they really do prefer to have these big old trees where they eat their fish.
There's a question about, there are many thank yous, by the way. There are many thank yous. There's a question about your work with Indigenous people who are still on the land, caretaking the land, and how your knowledge and you listening to and learning and back and forth. Can you say a little bit more about that working relationship, or how that might be something affecting your teaching, your research? I mean, say a little bit more about that relationship you have with your Indigenous colleagues.
It's so special. I'm so fortunate. I didn't used to work with Indigenous people because I was so embedded within the forest government and my research, but I was struggling, right? I struggled with forest practices because I saw them as ripping ecosystems apart, about disconnecting the relationships. And in about 2014, I had the opportunity to hire a postdoc who was Tsimshian Nation. Her name is Dr. Teresa Ryan. Her Tsimshian name is Simhayetsk, which means real copper. And we just started talking, and she was telling me about her research with the salmon and my research about these networks and connection in the forest. And she said, this is our worldview. It is about connection. It is all connected together. And I was like, oh my God, like I've been struggling with the traditional forestry community and academic view of forests, the science, which was all male driven, because forest science was all done by males prior to letting girls in the about 1980. And here was this very inclusive view of the world, this worldview that I was struggling to understand and fighting against the other worldview. And I'm just like, oh, manna from heaven. I was so grateful. And so then ever since then, I thought, this is it. This is the key. This is what's been missing. And so my whole view of ecosystems, it was solidified, but also deepened in such a, in a respectful way. And then understanding too, she explained so much about the social institutions and the reproduction of those social institutions, which was based on caring for the resources, for their obligations to care for the resources, and how this was reproduced through, you know, their ceremonies, the potlatch, and the feast systems. And I thought this all, you know, it's so culturally deep and embedded. And I thought this is how we need to be. We need to be embedded in our forests. And so now all of my work I do with Aboriginal people, and they've come to me and I go to them. And you know, I have, my circle is growing and growing and growing of all many different nations, and I want it to grow more. I need more time. I want to spend more time with them because I'm learning all the time. So yeah, it's incredibly enriching. If you ever have a chance, or make those, you have to build the relationships, right? You've got to put the time in, build the trust, build the relationships, spend the time. And it's not quick. It's not like doing a bacteria study in a lab where you can do it in 6 months. It takes years, but it's so worth it because you just learn so much more. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, I think all of us who are teachers are radically changing how we teach. And so that's another really important lesson from your work.
Yes.
So believe it or not, we're actually probably should close because Paul has to moderate another session that he's going to head over to at 3:35. So read.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And read Finding the Mother Trees if you haven't read that already. It's beautiful, and it's an important book for women, for mothers, for science, for the earth, because we need to fall in love with the earth again. I think that was a beautiful part of your talk. So
thank you very much.
Thank you, Suzanne and Paul. I guess we're going to leave the session now.
Thank you so much.
And thanks for everybody for being here.
Thank you
Paul
so
for
much.
organizing.
Yes.
Thank you so much for
Thank
being
you.
here today.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.